We're back with a bonus conversation you'll only see here on CBS News New York. So we're talking about the budget, and I'm wondering how you feel about the whole question of charter schools and increasing the number of charter schools in New York City.
I don't think there's an appetite in the legislature to increase the cap for the city. The cap is there for a reason. I think there's just been discussion in the last few days about the zombie schools, which are schools that have already been approved. They have approved status, but they just have kind of gotten stuck in this gray area of charters that might be available because some schools have closed.
Right.
And so the cap, we're not strictly speaking at the cap, even though the number has been granted. Some have been shut down in the meantime. So there's a handful that I think is the subject of this conversation right now.
But I also think that there's been a discussion about whether you should not allow charter schools to increase the number of grades that they have. You know, like if you start an elementary school, and you suddenly decide to go, instead of from say K through 8, you're suddenly K through 12. Is that something also that the legislature would look at?
Well, that's another way to increase the scope and the number of these charters, right? Because a high school is a high school, and middle school is a middle school. But I think more of the conversation has been, at this stage, very limited in nature to the zombie status. I think there's maybe 13 or 14 available in that respect. And one of the things that I've heard discussed among members that support it all, some don't, to be clear, is to make sure that if we do this, that these schools that receive the charters are community-based schools, particularly if they're in communities of color, that they reflect the management, the administration, the school reflects the community that they're in.
You know, but it's sort of an interesting debate, because a lot of times you go into communities and people think, especially in communities of color, they want to get their kids into charter schools because they don't exactly like the schools in their own home districts. So there's a lot of pressure to have charters, but then there's also a lot of pressure to keep people in public schools because you want to support public schools.
Well, that's exactly the problem, right? This is the debate that's been going on for decades now in New York, which is the more you increase alternatives to public schools, the more you're condemning the public schools to a worse fate. What we need to do is invest in the public school system, the traditional public school system. I'm a product of that myself. I went to schools with numbers on them, PS 84 or 141 for junior high school. And what you need to do is make those schools better, because no matter how many kids you pluck out of that environment to put them in a charter school, whether they perform better or not, you're only making it harder for the people who are going to traditional public schools.
Especially when you point out the fact that New York City schools have lost 200,000 students in the last several years, which means that they have, less money because they have less students.
Yeah, it's a real problem. And rather than, in a sense, giving up on the public school system, what we need to do is rededicate ourselves to making it better.
So there's a big budget deadline here in New York City on Wednesday, because New York City has to do its own budget by Wednesday, and the mayor has been complaining that he can't do his budget because you haven't done your budget, and he doesn't know how to budget. And one of the biggest things I think he's looking at is the governor's request that the city pay $500 million in additional money to the MTA, and he says that's really onerous for the city. I wonder what advice you'll be giving the mayor in terms of his budget, and whether he thinks he's going to have another $500 million hole for the MTA.
Well, I support him on that, and the Senate supports him. I think the Assembly supports him as well. We expressed our opposition to that effort by the governor, and I don't think it will be $500 million at the end of the day. Maybe it'll be a significantly smaller number, but we were able to beat back efforts to have the city hand over that larger check. As it relates to administering their own budget, this is not the first time the state budget's been late, unfortunately. Many years ago, before my time, it would go all the way into August, and so the city,
I actually remember that.
The city is schooled in how to do its own budget even when the state budget's undecided, so I'm sure they'll figure it out.
I know, but I mean, you're right, it did go into August. I think it was David Patterson, I forget.
David Patterson, and then all the way back under Governor Pataki, it routinely went that late.
Is that true?
Oh, yeah.
So another issue that the mayor is really interested in is minimum wage, increasing the minimum wage. Your thoughts about that?
Anything we can do to help lift people up in a very expensive city, we should do. The Senate advocated for increasing the minimum wage as part of our budget discussion. The governor proposed indexing it to inflation, but not raising the number, and so we're trying to negotiate that out and hopefully help people get by. There's a lot of talk about, let's make sure the wealthy people are okay so they don't feel like they have to leave. But very rarely do we talk about helping the people who literally can't afford to live here, and those people are also fleeing. If they can't pay their rent, they're getting kicked out of their homes. They're going to end up somewhere else, and so we should also think about making sure the workforce is present in New York, especially when we have a labor shortage in so many ways.
Well, you raised the issue of the wealthy. I mean, do you think there's going to be new taxes either on corporations or on people who are well off?
The governor has made it clear she does not want to do that, and so it's been difficult to make progress on that issue. There may be some modest efforts in the corporate area as it relates to funding the MTA. That's still unresolved. We're trying to get to resolution on where that $1 billion we spoke about is coming from, and so there's some ideas to try and do that.
Yeah, but $1 billion, I mean, there's going to have to be a lot of new revenue sources, guaranteed revenue sources for the MTA in order to come up with that $1 billion, especially if half of it is not going to come from the city.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a menu of options that have been presented to deal with that. We talked about residential parking as one of them. The MTA is proposing a fare hike, which we oppose. The governor wants to increase a payroll mobility tax, which hits the payrolls of companies in the MTA region. What we're trying to do now is kind of find the right items off that menu so that we get the number we want for the MTA, but are doing it in the most responsible way possible.
You know, you raised the idea of a fare hike. You know, the MTA traditionally has done a fare hike, a small fare hike, every 2 years, every 4 years, whatever. Are you opposed to it this year because you think people have gone through the pandemic, you're trying to get riders back? What's the thinking there?
This is all relative. The money's got to come from somewhere, right? And so the MTA has traditionally relied very heavily on the fare box. But these are working people and people who are not riding around the city in limousines or Ubers for the most part. They're sitting there and paying their fare and getting on the subway. It's the people who can least afford it. So in some sense, fare increases are regressive in terms of who they impact in this city. I would much rather see, you know, we talked about the free buses. It's going in one direction on one and the opposite on the other if you allow a fare hike on the subways, but free buses on the other hand. I think the cost of riding the system should be minimal. It will encourage more people to get on the subway, and it will help the people who can least afford it to maintain a life in New York City.
Yeah, but when you do that, you have to say, okay, fine, it should be minimal, but who's going to pay for that?
Well, this is what we keep.
Because it's not free.
Yeah, it's not free. There's got to be money for it, and we proposed a variety of options, including an increase in the corporate franchise surcharge for the MTA. There's a thing that already exists that companies who benefit from the MTA put a little bit of their profits into the MTA system. So we proposed increasing that enough to help fill the hole.
What about increasing the sales tax another little bit the way they do now for the MTA?
But again, you're talking about taxes that hit working and poor people more than they would impact the wealthy. And I think if we believe in a progressive system of taxation, which I certainly do, we should be finding ways to get money from those who have the money, not try and take it out of the pockets of the people who are struggling.
I guess it must be an interesting balance to think about, because you also have corporations that are saying stop taxing us, and now they have the ability because of remote work to actually leave New York entirely and go to another state. So, you know, is there a concern that you reach a point where you're taxing corporations too much and they say, we're moving out?
Yeah, of course that's a concern. And the other side of that concern is what I just mentioned earlier, which is we're worrying about actual working people leaving the state, which is also happening, and we've got to stop that from coming. You talk about the wealthy and they're leaving, and there's always examples that the media likes to identify, and they're troublesome. We don't want people leaving New York. But New York has more millionaires today than we had before the pandemic. So
is that true?
Yes. So as people are leaving, either we're generating more millionaires within the state or more are coming here. And so on a net basis, we don't have an exodus of wealth from the state. And what we do have is a problem people affording to live here and people having a tough time getting by.
So you're basically saying don't believe the press releases put out by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis that New Yorkers are coming to Florida?
I wouldn't believe any press release Ron DeSantis puts out as a starting point, no matter what it's about. But certainly, look, there are people going there. You could find people who've left New York and gone to Florida and many other states. You can also find people who have come to New York, and those stories are not told as much. And then you can also find homegrown New Yorkers who are just doing better and being more successful, which is great.
So let's talk about the Court of Appeals. The Senate this past week approved a new chief judge, be the first African-American judge to head the Court of Appeals, and also a new appointee to fill his position. Do you think this is going to change the direction of the Court of Appeals at this time and when we're under assault from decisions from the Supreme Court?
Yeah, I certainly hope so, and that was a big reason why many of us opposed the previous nominee. I did not think that the first nominee the governor put forward would represent that kind of change. This Court of Appeals has historically been a beacon for the rest of the country. It's produced Supreme Court justices. It's been someone looked to by other states to figure out the direction that the law should be taking. And we lost our way. Under the previous administration, under Janet DeFiore, the reputation of this court sank considerably. They took less cases. They started deciding in ways that were inconsistent with previous administrations of the Court of Appeals. And there were a couple of judges who still sit on the court who were kind of on her team in that respect. So many of us wanted to see a change in that, and we got that now with Rowan Wilson, who's going to be a phenomenal chief judge for our Court of Appeals. He's widely respected. He has an incredible intellect, both legally and just in general, and I'm excited to see what he's going to do with that court.
Are you also concerned about, there's two issues, one being abortion rights and the other being gun control? Are you concerned about decisions coming down from the Supreme Court that could affect us here in New York?
Well, that's why I think this has gotten so much attention of late. Courts of appeals have been going on for many, many years, and rarely has it gotten the public attention that it's gotten the last several months, because state courts are now more important than ever. The U.S. Supreme Court we can no longer rely on to protect our rights and to keep us moving forward. In fact, the opposite is happening. They're reversing decisions that are 50 years old that we've come to expect as ones that protect New Yorkers. And now the state courts are going to have to do that whenever they can, and that's why it's so important that we get the right people and the right type of judge.
So one of the issues, and this is my last question, one of the issues that this court may have to decide is the whole redistricting issue. There have been appeals that would allow the redistricting commission to redraw the lines yet again, saying that the courts shouldn't have been redrawing them the first time around, and it could go all the way up to this Court of Appeals. How do you feel about that? I mean, do you think, is there a chance that the lines for Congress, the Senate, and the Assembly could be redrawn again going into the 2024 election cycle?
Well, the Assembly's off to the side because they weren't part of the original case, and so they actually...
And there was just a decision that...
Right, they actually have commission maps that we're likely to enact next week. So they're off to the side. They're already taken care of. The case that you referenced about is not something we have anything to do with. That's come from Washington and from the members of Congress who I think have an interest in challenging those lines. So the Senate lines currently are not part of any litigation either. It's really just...
Well, I thought that the governor and the attorney general were part of that suit.
They have said they're going to support the suit that has been brought. So they're going to file, I suppose they'll file an amicus brief or whatever form that takes to express their position. But the case itself is only about the congressional lines. It has nothing to do with the Senate or the Assembly, at least at this time. I suppose people can try and expand it in the future.
Do you think the congressional line should be redrawn?
I'm going to leave that to the courts to figure out. I think the Court of Appeals was wrong the first time around. My opinion is pretty clear on that. And even if the courts, this is where I think they went completely wrong, is even if the courts believed that there was something about the lines that were improper, the Constitution of the state requires it to be handed back for a second try. And neither the commission or the legislature was given that opportunity. They just gave it to an upstate judge.
That was sort of forum shopping, wasn't it? Of
course it was. That's a part of the problem. That being said, in the Senate, we're living with the lines that were drawn for us. We have a supermajority even under those lines, so we're doing okay with the way things were drawn by that judge. In Congress, I suppose they have a different view, so they're asking for another round of commission work. Well,
I think Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader of the House, is concerned about all the seats that went to Republican districts, and they want to see if they can redraw the lines. Yeah, and there's been a lot of talk about that. The one thing I've been trying to make clear to people is the problem that happened in 2022 in the races for Congress was a problem of performance, of the candidate's performance, not so much of the lines. We actually did this exercise, intellectual exercise, of overlaying the results of the election with the maps that we drew, that some people thought even went too far. So would it have changed? It changed 2 seats. That's it? That's it. And mind you, if you take a step back from what we did because people thought it was too aggressive, you get less than that. So you likely would have ended up in a similar scenario either way. It's just that our candidates were losing Biden districts in 2022, and hopefully that will be better next year. Michael Gianaris, thank you so much for joining me.